interrupt this debate for an emergency news bulletin. It's Britney Watch, keeping you up to date with all your Britney Spears news.
Remember that time that South Park covered Britney Spears and it was one of the most messed up episodes in the entire show? I remember. Oh God, do I ever remember. Now, I don't know about you guys, but for me, as a South Park fan, I feel like I have a pretty high tolerance for shocking humor and outrageous imagery. It's kind of just something that goes hand in hand with watching this show. But every now and then, we get an episode that does something so brutal or edgy that even I feel overwhelmed. Which I know sounds crazy, but when you have episodes like Human Sentai Pad, with Kyle falling victim to the cuttlefish and asparagus, it can get a little hard to watch. But while that episode takes the cake for South Park's most disgusting episode, I think the most shocking has gotta be Britney's new look. Cause man, do they ever go wild with this one. It's an extremely polarizing episode that is loved by some and hated by many, and it's just gotta be one of the most messed up and controversial episodes in the entire show. Now for most people, when they hear that an episode is hard to watch and hated by many, it usually means that it's on their skip list. Maybe they watch it once and move on and that's it. But not me, because when I hear that an episode is controversial and intense, I think, that's gonna be fun to talk about. Yummy. And so that's what we're gonna do here today. We're gonna take a look at exactly why this episode is so polarizing, why they made it the way they did, and how I personally feel about it. So I hope you have your safety goggles on, cause look, I couldn't think of a clever joke this time. Can we just roll the clip and move on?
You mean it was just a joke? My kids ain't here?
Now, when I say that Britney's new look is a very polarizing episode, I mean that when you talk to modern South Park fans, they seem to either love it or hate it. Or at least that's what I've gathered from the online discussion around it. But if we go back to 2008 and look at the critical and audience reception for the episode back then, it tells a bit of a different story. And that story is much more negative than what we see today. For example, if you look at the IGN review for the episode or the blog critics review, you'll see that it was generally considered underwhelming and below average for a South Park episode at that time, with both reviewers noting that it was too disturbing and not very funny. And yes, I'm only including a review from some website called Blog Critics because it was mentioned on the episode's Wikipedia page, because I'm such a pro at research. But even if you look at web forums from 2008, you can see that South Park fans weren't very receptive to the episode. For example, most people on No Homers voted it a 1 or 2 out of 5, with almost everybody there expressing general disappointment with the show. And just like with the critics, the most common complaints there was that it was too difficult to watch and that it was lacking in the funny. Now, the disturbing part I can understand because, well, Britney Spears blows her head off with a shotgun in the first 6 minutes of this episode, which I would say is the shocking part, but because this is South Park, it's actually when she spends the rest of this episode walking around with half a head.
Britney, what were you thinking? First you shave your head and now this. Well, it's a ballsy new look, I'll give you that.
Now, just in case any of you were unfamiliar with this episode, despite clicking on the video, the general premise is that the boys find out you can make assloads of money by selling pictures of Britney Spears to the tabloids, which they discover from a Britney Watch news alert where she's being torn apart for peeing on a ladybug. And so they form a plan to join the paparazzi by trying to snap a good picture of her while she's briefly staying in South Park. And so they pose as her kids to get past security, dress Butters up as a squirrel, which I didn't really have to mention, but I did because I love it. And then they sneak into Britney Spears' hotel room where she's crying on the phone about all the media harassment. Now, what follows is probably one of the boldest moments in South Park history, which is when Britney shoots herself in the face with a shotgun. A twist that I don't think anyone expected when they first saw this episode, but as I mentioned, the crazy part of this is that where most shows would probably end the story like this, South Park begins the story this way. Because Britney pulling that trigger sets up what this episode is really about, and that's the media machine that was capitalizing on her declining mental health at the time and the industry that formed around it. But before we get into the whole headless Britney Spears walking around thing, I just want to take a second to talk about how brilliantly executed this whole scene is, because it really just nails everything in one go. It starts with the boys successfully breaking into Britney's room, only for Butters to refuse to move forward with their plan, causing them to spend the entire scene arguing with each other as if Britney isn't there. And because they're so caught up with their plan, they're completely oblivious to the fact that not only is she at her limit, but their lie about being her kids is the very thing that pushed pushed her over the edge. It's actually a very heartbreaking moment because Britney gets really excited when she finds out that her sons are there, like it's the one thing that seems to bring her joy in this difficult time she's going through. But then the disappointment of finding out that it's not her boys, and that it's just another group of people looking to exploit her, ends up being the final nail in the coffin that prompts her to pull out a gun right in front of them. Which again, they don't even notice because they're so selfishly preoccupied with the money they're hoping to make. It's just such a great way of commenting on the dehumanization of tabloid culture and how far we let it go. Because we're also quick to forget that indulging in that stuff comes with a cost, and we only ever seem to notice the consequences of stuff like this when it's too late. And that's something that this scene captures perfectly. Because that moment when Britney pulls the trigger and the boys just stand there in disbelief, completely silent, that is one of the most uncomfortable moments in the entire show. And they really hold on that shot for like an extra 10 seconds just to drive the point home. They make you sit with it, which almost feels like the absurd facade of parody that accompanies every South Park episode just gets blown right off the screen with Britney's face. Hell, even Cartman just nopes right out of there. Even he can't handle what just happened. So point being, it's a dark episode with a serious message, and they very much want you to know it. But of course, like I said, this is South Park, so the immediate follow-up to such an uncomfortable scene is the most ridiculously edgy joke you could possibly think of. Britney survives.
Miss Spears, these boys wanted to say something.
Oh my God! Oh no!
The boys are just shocked at how good you look, Brittany. Right, boys?
Only South Park could ever think of something this messed up and do it. Like, Jesus Christ, bro. But at the same time, it's exactly what makes the episode so effective. Because like I said, most shows wouldn't have her survive. They would use her death to make their point, and that would be that. But South Park really wants you to understand just how up this Britney Spears tabloid culture really was. They want you to see that it doesn't matter if it's obviously pushing someone to the brink of death, the paparazzi will keep going anyways. And let me tell you, as someone who was around during Britney's meltdowns in the late 2000s, the media obsession with her really was everywhere you went. Like, everyone was talking about it, even people who didn't care about her music, and it felt inescapable. It was all over the internet, it was in magazines, it was even in random Flash cartoons. Like, even when I was doing research for this video, I typed in Britney's new look into Google and accidentally found a BBC website from 2007 that was basically on her for shaving her head. And that was exactly the kind of cry for help that she was doing at the time that inspired this episode. Like, I know that South Park exaggerates how bad the press was to make a statement, but it really seemed like they were intentionally pushing her towards self-destructive behavior because they knew it meant more stories for them to cover. In fact, according to Trey and Matt, one of the main reasons that they decided to do this episode in the first place was because the culture had gotten so out of hand that even mild-mannered people seemed to be cheering for her death.
It was kind of unnerving that time, especially like you'd go out to dinner with like really mild-mannered people and like, I can't wait to see her just herself. How's she gonna herself? You're like, really, man? Like, really?
That part is still so crazy to me no matter how many times I hear it. Plus, you just know that things are super when South Park is actually being sympathetic towards a celebrity. Cause let's be real, South Park almost exclusively on celebrities, and it's been that way since the very first season. So for them to be defending Britney Spears, for them to feel like that's an important message to get across, says a lot about how she was being treated at that time. And it also says a lot about how silent the rest of the media was, cause I mean, nobody was reporting on that. All we really had was Chris Crocker.
And how dare anyone out there make fun of Britney after all she's been through? All you people care about is readers and making money off of her. She's a human!
Of course, today, the conversation about Britney has changed quite dramatically. We now know much more about how she was being abused and controlled and treated like a product by her own family, and the severe and lasting damage that's done to her mental well-being, which only makes this episode feel more effective in my opinion. Just one of the biggest W's in the show, honestly. Aged like fine wine. But that W came with a sacrifice, because going super dark to get their message across was almost too effective, which is why many find it disturbing to the point that they can't even enjoy it. And I think that's a reasonable thing to complain about, because at the end of the day, even if South Park is good at cultural commentary, most fans adopted the show because they find it funny and entertaining, which means they probably don't want to spend the entire episode feeling incredibly bummed out by the horrific imagery. Because like, yeah, there's a pretty good chance that you're gonna feel bummed out watching a headless Britney Spears run around as everyone harasses her for insignificant bullshit that doesn't really matter, like if she's gained 10 pounds or if she had plastic surgery. So I think that's a pretty fair piece of criticism for this episode. And if we're being real here, here, that's not even the full extent of what makes this episode difficult to watch. Because at the end of the second act, we find out that not only has the press been harassing Brittany like a bunch of bloodthirsty body snatcher zombies, but that apparently they've been doing it on purpose because they want to kill her, which has got to be one of the darkest twists in the history of this show. Because in this episode, there's no "I learned something today" that attempts to salvage what's left of her life. There's no optimistic ending. There is just the brutal acceptance that she's gonna die and that there is no fighting it, which even Stan and Kyle choose to give into by the end. I know this might sound weird, but seeing Stan and Kyle join in actually feels like the darkest part of the episode to me, because they're usually the ones who infuse this show with optimism by turning things around at the end, and so you really want to see them save Brittany and change the world for the better like they always do. But here, they realize that there's no fighting this, it's hopeless, and so they give in, which I think is extra uncomfortable because it turns a mirror on the audience and shows us that this is exactly what we're doing. We're giving in. We're feeding the media machine. It's only still going because we engage with it. That's why, for the final act of this episode, they turn it into a modified retelling of The Lottery, which, if you don't know, because you didn't have to read it in high school like I did, it's an old story about a village where people sacrifice a young girl to the gods in order to get a bountiful harvest of corn. Except, you know, in this case, they're sacrificing Brittany to get a bountiful harvest of corn.
Sacrifice in March, corn have plenty starch.
Yeah, them South Park folk really do love that corn. But seriously though, the corn is obviously just a metaphor here, because the real harvest is Brittany's demise and the profit that's to be made off of it. I mean, that's why they did the whole half-head thing in the first place, right? Because we're never satisfied until things have been pushed to their absolute limit. And I mean, yeah, they're laying it on thick, but it's a very strong message, because the truth is that we're all willing to turn a blind eye until it's too late. That's why the media in this episode focuses on stuff like her weight or her camel toe. It's like they don't even notice that she's blown half her head off. They just keep going until the rest of it's gone too.
This video was taken just hours ago as Brittany was wheeled into the hospital for some reason. And if we zoom in on the footage, right here, you can also definitely see a boob job scar.
Man, I love how harsh this episode was towards anyone who was buying into the Britney stuff at the time, because watching it forces you to ask some pretty hard questions, like, why do we take such pleasure in celebrity downfalls? Why do we lose sight of someone's humanity and find enjoyment in their suffering? Is it because they're rich and have it better than us? Does that make it justifiable? And like, obviously that's gonna really depend on the person asking and the celebrity we're talking about, but in the case of Britney Spears, a relatively harmless figure, a pop star, it's hard to feel good about consuming her downward spiral, even if we all have some kind of dark side that likes to see things fall apart. And I know you know what I'm talking about, we've all seen it, like the people who rewatch Breaking Bad and still cheer for Walter White, or hacker trolls in GTA that aren't there to give you free stuff, or Annie. No, I'm not explaining that last one. If you don't get it, you're not ready to know. But that story that Trey and Matt tell about the mild-mannered person who was casually guessing that Brittany was gonna blank herself, that is f***ed up. And it's f***ed up because you'd think that their line would have been drawn sooner, you know, before it was a matter of life and death. But because everyone got in on it together, which motivated the media to keep pushing things bit by bit, our lines moved. And that's one of the things that this episode is drawing attention to. For the people in 2008 that were consuming the toxic Britney stuff, this episode says that they're guilty too. That they're part of the reason that Britney Spears is walking around with half a head and being harassed by hordes of paparazzi. And I just think that makes the whole thing that much more disturbing, because it means that when this episode came out, it wasn't just the image that made viewers uncomfortable. It's the fact that they were partly responsible for it. It was collectively our fault that Britney was missing the top of her head, which brings it to a whole new level of hard to watch because it means that we're the monsters. Yeah, that's right, folks. We're getting real deep with this South Park video. This is a philosophy channel now. Next, we're gonna talk about sacrifice, and if it's even possible for the masses to have a good life without someone suffering on their behalf. But yeah, the point is that there are multiple reasons that Britney's new look made audiences so uncomfortable, and I think that's a big part of why it was met with such a bitter reception. Because we just have a natural aversion to anything that leaves us feeling unresolved, which this one happens to do in a very deep cutting way. But then again, this episode isn't the first time that South Park has gone dark and left audiences unhappy. In fact, it actually happens to be from an era that has one of the darkest and most disliked episodes in the show's history, the season 10 finale, Stanley's Cup.
No hope. No hope.
Much like with Brittany's new look, when this episode aired, a lot of people did not walk away happy, myself included, because it's just such a bummer of an episode, and that ending is just so upsetting. And it doesn't even have an important message that it's attached to. It's just dark for the sake of being dark. So yeah, a lot of people didn't like it, especially back when it came out. But the thing about Stanley's Cup is that, as a whole, the episode is actually pretty funny. Like, when I go back to it now, knowing how it goes, I laugh a lot, because I'm over the darkness. If anything, I appreciate it now and the humor that's in it. I just needed that extra time to digest it. And I think that the same thing could be said about Brittany's new look. The reception for the episode today is much more of a mixed bag than it was when it came out. Instead of being predominantly negative, it now has many fans that stand by it and think it's a good episode, which I think is happening because we're further away from it now. Brittany made it through that time in her life, and that makes it easier to watch. But there's something else that an episode can do to make something really dark and messed up a lot easier to watch. And that is being really, really funny. Which brings us to the second major critique that people have of this episode: it's not funny. Yeah, you like that transition? I use Stanley's Cup like it's my bitch to get us to this topic. I'm the Mozart of words. Now available on t-shirts in my non-existent merch shop. Now, I think a lot of people would argue that this episode is intentionally less funny than the average South Park episode. That it purposely chooses to prioritize its dark message over comic relief because that ultimately makes it more effective. And to the people who believe in that ridiculous nonsense, I say, you're absolutely correct. Or at least that's what Trey and Matt said in their director's commentary.
It's less about laughs and more about, no, this is the point.
Right.
You know, and especially at the end where it's like, nope, it's not funny.
Right.
You just have to kind of sit here and watch it.
We're not putting the jokes in and the stoning, you know, and it's like...
Now, in all fairness, that commentary came out way after the negative reception to the episode, so maybe they're just trying to say it as an excuse. But I don't know. They chose to make the third act of this thing a retelling of the lottery, so maybe it's not an excuse. Because yeah, there are definitely moments in this episode that feel like they were designed to be depressing, particularly the ending stuff. And if that's the case, then that kind of justifies the criticism that people have of this episode, because being intentionally depressing does mean compromising on the humor to some degree, which can definitely make the episode less funny. I mean, it kind of goes back to the whole Terrence and Phillip thing, and how if you don't like their gag, it's not going to make a difference to you that it's intentionally stupid. You're just not gonna like Terrence and Phillip. But at the same time, if you ask me, I still don't think this episode is considered unfunny because Matt and Trey wanted it to be. And I say that because it has a ton of comedic beats throughout the whole thing, whether they land or not. So I mean, call me crazy, but I have this wild theory that the reason people don't find this episode very funny is not because it's dark, shocking, or depressing. It's because it's the same goddamn joke repeated over and over again. Like, how many times does this episode show Brittany trying to speak with half a head while people call her fat or slutty or stupid?
God, she's so stupid.
What do you expect? Look at her. She doesn't have most of her brain.
I know, she's really dumb, huh?
I mean, you can like it or dislike it, but you can't deny that it makes up the vast majority of the runtime. And so the issue ends up being something that is less about the contents of the episode and more about the structure. Because this is just one of those episodes, you know? The kind where South Park hones in on a single gag and makes that the primary focus, where the story is clearly designed around the joke. It's a format that the show has been doing for ages now, and Brittany's new look is just one of many entries in the list. I mean, arguably a lot of seasons 27 and 28 utilize that exact kind of episode structure too. And what I've noticed about this format is that it almost always leads to polarizing episodes, because it's just the kind of thing where if you love the gag they're focusing in on, then you're probably gonna enjoy the episode. But if you're not into it, then the whole thing just becomes a slog. And on top of that, when it comes to a topic like Britney Spears, especially in the way they did it in this episode, it has the unfortunate trade-off of giving us less traditional South Park stuff. Because like, even though Stan and Kyle are on screen throughout a lot of this thing, it really doesn't feel like an adventure with the boys. And there isn't much of South Park the town at play here either. It's really just heavily focused on the Britney stuff. And I just think that really increases the odds of South Park fans being unhappy with the episode, unless they're really into the Britney gag. But you know, having said that, I don't think that the one gag episode format is necessarily a bad thing, because one of the most successful South Park episodes in recent history did exactly that, and people loved it, which was the Canadian prince and his wife being super annoying in Worldwide Privacy Tour.
Leave us alone! Down with the monarchy! We deserve our privacy!
I think a big part of why the one gag format worked in that episode as opposed to the Brittany one is because the comedic concept behind it was just stronger. Like sure, Brittany talking with half a head is funny, but it's not as rich or deep with comedic opportunity as something like the prince harassing people to demand they leave him alone. And because that joke has more to give, it works better when they explore it in different scenarios. Like we have the talk show, the montage, moving in across from Kyle, the fireworks and drumming at night, the prince's blue penis. It all hits because the escalation feels increasingly ridiculous. And you can see that they were trying to do that exact same kind of structure with the Britney episode. They also wanted to explore the gag in different ways. There's the reveal of her half head, the Britney watch stuff, the recording studio bit, the MTV performance, which in my opinion is probably the funniest escalation. And then of course her death, which is more of a curveball than a traditional joke. But I think that for a lot of viewers, those escalations just don't land as well because they're not different enough. We already take the gag to 10 by the start of the second act of the episode, and that just doesn't leave a lot of room to push it further from there, which in my opinion is where the comedic portion of this episode really suffers. Or at least that's why I think so many people found this episode unfunny. But also, you know, I kind of feel inclined to say this. Who gives a f what people think? This is subjective as hell. A lot of people do find this episode funny, myself included. Now to be fair, that might just be because I'm Canadian, or at least Trey Parker seems to think that's why.
And it's weird, the more we traveled north, like a lot of people in Canada really liked it, and a lot of people in New York really liked it.
Man, I'm really using a lot of director's commentary in this video. This gotta be a new record for me. But anyways, my point is that I've been talking a lot about what other people liked or didn't like about this episode, why they found it disturbing or unfunny. But now, as someone who actually thinks it's pretty decent, I want to talk about how I feel about the episode, which in other words means it's time for some good old-fashioned slush-style glazing. And maybe a bit of criticism too. Now first of all, I'd like to directly contest the idea that this episode isn't funny by reminding us all that it has squirrel butters. Look at him, he's a squirrel, very good. Now am I shallow and easy to please for finding squirrel butters so enjoyable? Yes. Is it the weakest possible argument I could have to prove that this episode doesn't suck? Probably. But he's a squirrel, so checkmate, mother. Nah, but for real though, even if you're not a fan of the joke repetition, you gotta admit, the initial reveal that Britney was still alive and that she's missing half her head, that was extremely funny. Everything from the way her tongue moves and even just the ridiculous sounds that she makes when she's trying to talk, that is gold, bro. Admit it. And like I said earlier, the MTV performance that she does is also incredible. Not just because of how ridiculous it is to see her doing it without a head, but also because of how accurate it was to her actual MTV performance from that time. Like, I don't know what it is, but there's just something hilarious about all these sexed up dudes dancing with her in South Park style. Like, I honestly think it would still be kind of funny even without the headless part because they're just so lame and goofy looking. So the fact that she is headless just makes it that much funnier. And stuff like that makes me feel like people are underrating how much this episode actually does get out of the headless Britney thing. And that's not even including my absolute favorite joke of the episode, which happens near the end when Stan is trying to escape with Britney to the North Pole. Because throughout this whole thing, the press and the media keep commenting on how she's showing so much camel toe and how it's disgusting. And like on its own, that joke is maybe mildly funny. But when the train conductor looks back at Stan and realizes that Britney is a passenger, it kills me every goddamn time.
It's her. I'm sure it's Britney Spears. It looks just like the picture.
That is just such a top tier gag, man. I don't know. And it's a joke I love for two reasons. One, it's very classic South Park style. It feels like something they would have done in the old seasons, which is very up my alley. And the build up around the camel toe gag with all the comments earlier in the episode just makes it hit so well. So yeah, I think that when you zoom out and look at this episode as a whole, the pacing and the humor is actually pretty consistent. Like yeah, it's not awesome-o, it's not a non-stop barrage of laughs every minute, but there are a handful of big laughs evenly spread across it. So if we're to believe Trey and Matt when they said that this episode is intentionally prioritizing darkness over comedy, then I think that they did a pretty good job of still keeping things fairly funny throughout. Though I'll admit that there is a bit of a lull in the second act before the big plot twist that sets up the finale. That's probably the point where things feel the most repetitive for me and the least funny. Like it's just starting to lose steam. But that only accounts for a very small portion of the episode, and I feel like the third act does a really good job of getting things back into shape. So it's not a major complaint for me, but it is the kind of thing that maybe knocks it down half a point. Aside from that, I think my only other complaint here is how they use the boys. Because when the episode starts, we have Stan, Kyle, Cartman, and Butters all together, but by the end of the first act, Cartman and Butters just dip out of the episode for the rest of the runtime. And I think that was a pretty unfortunate choice because I feel like their presence would have really helped round things out, you know? Like that lull in the second act probably could have been filled by some good interactions between the boys, some classic South Park adventure vibes, because I do think the show is strongest when it's being told through their perspective. But instead, it turns into more of a Stan and Kyle story, and even then, it's not really that either, because it's not like we're getting Stan and Kyle as their usual selves. It's more like they're stuck in panic mode the whole time, while acting as vessels for the audience to relate to. We're not getting any funny quips from them in this episode. They aren't providing the typical South Park humor we're used to getting from them, which, you know, is fine, it works, but it obviously would have been way better if we had all four boys together instead, which I think would have gone a long way in pleasing the people who weren't as into this episode. But I don't know, maybe asking for a version of this story that balances its dark message with a more traditional South Park tone is just asking for too much. Maybe that message wouldn't have gotten across as well. It's hard to say for sure, but that's just what I would have wanted out of the episode. Also, I gotta ask, where the hell is Kenny? Why are they doing my boy dirty like that? I mean, we get Kenny's parents at the end, and that fake Jeff Goldblum from the episode canceled, and Butters' aunt and uncle from LA, but no Kenny? Very upsetting. Very upsetting. Anyways, that's how I feel about the episode, but since it's so polarizing, I'm curious to know, what did you think of this one? Are you a fan? Do you skip it? Do you want the nachos that Cartman was eating at the beginning? Do you think about how they are probably the same assets as the chips he ate in Casa Bonita? Let me know in the comments below for a chance to win absolutely nothing. Bye!